So actually, I've got a question for our awesome presenters, just to get things rolling. So in terms, and this is something that Simon kind of touched on early on, and other people have mentioned, how far do you think the pandemic has changed the conversation around this? Has it made it more important for organisations? Has it made it less important? On the one hand, in effect, the information suppliers, and then for people with disabilities, how has this impacted them? In both good and bad ways.
I think from conversations that I'm overhearing, one of the things that it has made it very obvious to organisations is that you don't need to be in the office. And for a lot of people with disability, that travel to and from the office is one of the barriers to being in full-time employment or being in employment at all. And particularly here in Melbourne, where we had 110 days of lockdown and nobody was allowed to leave the home except for essential reasons, everybody who possibly could was working from home. And I think that has highlighted that very much, that and the organisations jumped to it and provided the facilities so that people could do that. So that I think that's one of the realisations that has probably come out of the COVID experience, is that we don't all need to be huddled around a whiteboard, in a room for a meeting. We can do a lot of the work that we do in a virtual sense, which, fingers crossed, will open the doors to opportunity for more people with disabilities to be able to gain employment.
Look, I'll talk from a higher education sector. I found it a bit of a revolution, and we've got in the audience one of our fantastic people from our LX transformation team that really put accessibility up front in a way that I haven't seen it before, because the online accessibility is both a requirement for learning, but also a fantastic tool that can be amplified for other people. So, for example, if you've got automatic online captioning, that's a really powerful visual reinforcer for learning. There's different channels of learning, different preferences for learning, and different ways for reinforcement of learning. So these accessibility features end up being good for other students, and also aid in the the very important market that we're having some terrible supply issues with at the moment. Our overseas student market, who predominantly have English as a second language, and to see the captioning going, that's one of the things that they love. It saves having to do, do inverted commas, specially do scripts. And so I've been using a different platform to this one when I know I've got meetings with people with disability who might have that requirement, or students from non-English speaking backgrounds, because it does a very good job of picking up and live captioning, just as I'm speaking here now. So there's lots of, in the higher ed sector, it's been in a way a no-brainer, but there's still a lot of issues with respect to what I call that interaction effect with assistive tech and different platforms. So just a little one, for some reason Dragon won't work, Dragon Naturally Speaking won't work in some environments, and that really slows down my productivity. And sometimes you don't know where those problems reside. You're not sure whether it's the vendor, your computer, the way it's been installed, or the one of the 1,001 hacks that you find on FAQ sites. So but when it's not working, I know how less effective I am in a day's work, because I'm back to my single finger typing with the use of the accessibility key functions that come with Windows or Mac operating system environments.
Thank you, Andrew and Simon. Any comments from Sarah and Lila?
I think from my perspective, what COVID did in the organisation I was working in was really prove the value of the work we'd achieved in the accessibility space, because when COVID hit, as an organisation, we didn't have to worry that our customers weren't getting our messages around COVID, because we knew that our main websites and app were accessible. And so for me, it actually just helped to really cement the hard work and the investment that we'd been making. But I do know from talking to others in the accessibility space, it is helping them to get traction to actually fund accessibility. So actually it works both ways. So for some, it gets swiped off the agenda together. For other organisations that maybe had to communicate critical information and couldn't, it became much more important. So the example I had even this morning was the COVID Tracer app in New Zealand, you know, that got a whole lot of attention when it was released because it wasn't accessible. So that's brought accessibility back into the agenda in New Zealand. So that's been a really great outcome for them.
Thank you. Right, we have some more questions, which is fantastic. So going up to the question from Scott's iPad, which is, how difficult was it to incorporate equity, diversity and inclusion into KPIs and job descriptions? So maybe hand that to Lila first.
It was difficult. I needed to work with people and culture. Getting it into the position description was relatively easy because I got lucky with timing. So our digital position descriptions were being rewritten. So I just squeezed them in, and the people and culture representative was more than happy to put them in. Getting them into the performance outcomes is going to be a much more challenging piece. So I just started that before I moved over to New Zealand. So I hadn't had the opportunity to finish that. But I was talking with people and culture and trying to get it added. So within our organisation, we had a drop down where you could choose your objectives, which PS, great, very convenient. And so I wanted to have our objectives added into those and mandatory for some roles. But yeah, I didn't get there. I think it requires a lot of influencing and building a really strong relationship within people and culture or HR.
Thank you. Any other comments from the rest of the panel?
I was going to call out that another part of that puzzle is that if your organisation has capability frameworks, particularly for those different roles we talked about, so design, dev, test, even your project managers and that kind of thing, I think building accessibility into your capability frameworks, and then also looking at supporting then the upskilling of people, because I think it was Lila called out, you know, there's not, we're seeing a lot more people actually starting to build accessibility into their job role and learning on the job, but it's still, yeah, there's still a lot of people who haven't come across it. So having those training programs, whether that be formal training programs, peer mentoring, that kind of thing, there's all sorts of ways to do that. But that's for me the other part, or somewhere else that you can actually build in accessibility as a capability.
I'll throw in also the importance of, with different organisations, the importance of the old Disability Action Plan, Disability Inclusion Action Plan as in really important starting points. I can tell you when I first got to UTS, it was a terribly adversarial environment where, and you know, I won't go into all the detail, but you know, you were fighting. You weren't just fighting an ignorance, you were fighting a different set of professional values. So there was a dominance of built environment, people with architectural backgrounds who just didn't see, that they saw aesthetic as the overriding principle. And they were in positions of power. And I mean, it was hand-to-hand combat, even when you could show on a plan that they were not producing an environment that was, you know, physically, just the physical stuff, not even talking about the ICT stuff. And then, of course, when you would take them to case after it was built and get it changed, they'd say, well, that's a cost of disability. So over the years, we're on to, I think, our 6th. And by the 2nd, there was responsibility, just like Lola was saying, across all areas. There was a beginning to see that, well, gee, you know, this is core for an education institution. And then I think we ended up, by our 5th, we had it down to 2 A4 pages. We've changed it about a bit this time. So Michaela has asked a question about, well, what do we do if we're just a small suburban public library? You find the champion that's the counsellor that is into access and diversity, and you say what you'd love to do in that small public library, and get a bit of lobbying going and get a bit of support behind it, and keep pushing up when people are asking for access and inclusion, and making sure it's memoed and minuted so they can't overlook it. Because disability and inclusion, as somebody told me when I went to a seminar at the big end of town only a few months ago, and said, I thought we're here for diversity and we've had only gender, you know, what about the rest? And they said, oh, there's not enough oxygen in the room for the rest. So, you know, if they can overlook it, they will. So, and I would say the local government environment, you know, is one where every local government's got to have a DAP. And that should go out across the whole area. And there should be people with responsibility at those different areas and put the pressure on them. They do stuff.
The Access and Inclusion Index really helped us as well. So So joining the Australian Network on Disability and actually committing to an access and inclusion plan, and then doing that, they call it the ANI Access and Inclusion Index, helped me enormously, because it gave us a position, and then that sort of appealed to the competitive nature of our leadership team. So suddenly they were like, oh, where are the other big corporates? Like, where are we? How are we going to beat them? Even though the point of the plan is not to beat others, it's to improve yourself year on year. That's sort of, it drove those competitive behaviours, which helped me to get more attention on accessibility and then drive further. And it's actually been enormously helpful. And I think anyone can do the access and inclusion plan. So I think small organisations could have a look at that and think about trying to understand where they stand on that. So it's all about your maturity in the access and inclusion space, and it's got 10 different criteria. It's a lot of work to complete it, but it's absolutely worth it. Yeah.
Just coming back to the library one. Sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I know of other organisations who have said the same thing as you, Lila, particularly organisations that have never had anything measurable. So the Access and Inclusion Index can sort of show you, where you are, and often for organisations that are a little less mature in accessibility, you're not coming out so good, and that can be the real leverage as well. And
it is often that digital area that is the lagger that shows up in that index in the first few rounds for organisations. I was just coming back to the library question that a few people have raised, and pick up on what Simon said about access and inclusion and disability action plans that all local governments, I think, around Australia would have these days, and recognise that what's the demographic that is using the resources in the library or wanting to borrow books. It's often the older demographic, not necessarily, but in terms of the physical access and so on. And we do know very clearly that disability and impairment increases with age. That's well and truly established in the Bureau of Statistics well and truly support that. So if you can pick up any aspects out of the Disability Action Plan, and a lot of those will talk about ageing and older residents as well, to drive that, that's a good way to pick it up. And there's always a responsible person, and usually a responsible counsellor that you can work with, as Simon suggested.
Yeah, and there was another question there also about non-for-profit sector and ILC grants, and quite rightly pointing out that sometimes it's very difficult to get them to accept costings that they haven't accepted before. But and certainly we've had that experience in the past with the Australian Research Council grants, where I'm sure they just put a line through us for even suggesting that access and inclusion needed to be costed. Well, we're in a very different environment these days, where disability organisations are monetarising their input into research areas, and they're also monetarising their co-design space. So it's expertise, and I would also say too, not every person with a disability is an expert on different areas, but there's a hell of a lot of people with disability within these organisations that do have tremendously valuable expertise that does need to be costed into processes. And unless we cost it in, then it doesn't get on the agenda well. So those areas are really important. And certainly if it's an ILC, reach out to the group and ask the question about those things, because every question that gets asked requires a response on paper, and that response on paper can be quite embarrassing.
Any other comments in the panel about not-for-profits or ILC grants? And I think one interesting theme that's been coming through from the panel is if you set up accessibility and inclusion as a thing on its own, it has a very high chance of failure. And it's when you embed it as part of broader organizational or social efforts that you actually get traction. So I think any more advice for people on this? What are there any kind of linkages that people could make that haven't been mentioned so far?
I think I just say it's a long game, and celebrate the small wins as you go, and sometimes you just have to keep trying until you get there, because I feel like the first year I was just battling and fighting, and I just kept persisting, and I kept going, and I kept trying different ways, and I had no money at that point. But then next year I got some money, and then you've just got to keep trying different ways to get there. And I really encourage you to do that, because it was so rewarding when I left where I was working just recently to move overseas, and I was like, I cannot believe what I achieved in 4.5 years, and I couldn't be more proud of what I've done within that organisation. And I think when you work in this space, it's really easy to get disheartened, but there are really small things you can do. And I remember early on, I reached out to another big corporate and to their accessibility function, and the gentleman that I spoke to said to me, Lila, make it simple, just give these people a few simple things to focus on initially. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't talk about WCAG. Think about their role and the small things that they can do. And there's some great resources out there. The South Australian government's created a really wonderful resource with different checklists for different roles. So, if you've got UX designers, they can find a checklist. There's lots of free training courses in the accessibility space. So if you have very little money, but you've got people that are willing and passionate about it, which you will need people to be passionate about it. You can start to use those resources and think about the simple things. It doesn't need to be all of WCAG straight away. You can build up to that over time.
Yeah, and the other one is that you don't have to be all things to all people at the beginning. So if there's little bits that you can pick off, And I've always been an incrementalist. I used to get really, really angry when I was first 4 or 5 years in the chair, where, you know, you just want everything. I just want it all right now. But you know, when you're playing the longer game, it's, you know, it's really sweet when some of the things come up. I had a photo further down, nothing to do with ICT technologies, but to do with heritage, and the, you know, the front of the New South Wales Art Gallery, where for years, you know, oh, we can't do that, it's heritage, it's heritage. And then a wonderful designer designed this amazing, you know, beautiful piece of art, sculpture that just happens to be a ramp as well. And it's a wonderful addition aesthetically, and I think really symbolic of what can be done when people think creative and laterally around reaching a goal to give people the same experience of walking through the front door. You know, really symbolic things. And in the digital world, you know, that is the front door to so many organisations for people today.
I think
Yeah,
the
well, I
other
think
thing I
that's
like, oh, sorry, Andrew.
just picking up on Simon, then you can do the other thing. Yeah, that's very true. You know, don't try and be a perfectionist up front. I think Layla was saying the same thing. You know, it's little steps. You know, if you try to be, make sure that you do everything for everybody in the first pass, you probably won't get to do anything, because it'll just be overwhelming for people. So all those little incremental steps, every little incremental step is going to improve it for somebody, and people will appreciate what you're doing you know, bit by bit. And, you know, at the end of the day, you know, you'll probably never get to perfection, because the digital world is just changing so rapidly. But, you know, just recognize that every little step you take makes it better for somebody, some group of people to interact with you in the digital world.
I was going to add, I think we talked about the top-down sort of having leadership support, which is going to be absolutely critical, you know, to your accessibility agenda. But I tend to myself work from the bottom up, and creating that culture of accessibility in the people who are actually doing the work, and building those accessibility champions and those accessibility advocates, because that really spreads. You need the top-down messaging, you need the support, you need the policies and that kind of thing, but often it's only as good as the people who are then doing the work. And what we want to do is not have accessibility seen as something that's onerous, or that I have to do it because my boss has told me, or that kind of thing, but actually and you're not going to get 100% of people, you know, on board, but, you know, really, I guess for me, build that culture, build that, you know, I really want to be doing this, I know why we're doing this, I'm proud of what we're doing, and that can be different things to different people. So for some people, it is the human element of, you know, I'm creating something, I'm not excluding people. For some people, it can be pride in their work. It can be more like a challenge. It could be a technical challenge for a developer, or you know, sort of something creative or innovative as someone is trying to work around or find a solution. So find those hooks at whatever level you're working at. You know, at the very, very top, it's often the business benefits, but for me, working, you know, tend to be working down at the team level. It's what are those hooks that I can hook into to turn people into those champions that are really doing that great work.
So, great advice coming from the panel. Some rolled gold in the chat as well from the participants. So everybody is pulling their weight. Lovely to see. So I think one thing that's been mentioned a few times is engaging the people from, you know, people with disabilities, the disability communities. So what should you not do in doing that, and then what is good practice?
engage and not follow through is probably what you don't want to do. So paying lip service to engaging people with disability, building things with people with disability, but not actually taking anything on. So I often, that's often just for show. I think that's what you don't want to have happen.
Be authentic. It's the same message, just different. If you're, if you're going to reach out, then feedback as well. The disability community is sick and tired of, and I'll talk more in the research space, but people that don't give back to the community. And it's simple. It's information. It's putting on seminars where they, where through those organisations that you went through before. There's more and more people with disability that aren't affiliated to organisations as well. So, you've got to be more diverse in the way that you message and communicate, because you just can't, there is no census list. And, some people are members of organisations for certain reasons, but a lot of people aren't. And we see this in the general community as well. In another area I work in, organised sport's been falling away for years, but there's a community base, and you've only got to use the example of cyclists. These are friendship groups and groups that come together and enjoy activity, but they're not hooked up. So how do you get to them? Well, it might be through, cycle shops, or it might be through specialist groups on Facebook, or it might be on Slack. There's all sorts of different channels for reaching people, and different impairment groups, have different ways they prefer to be reached as well.
I think to pick up on Lila's point of, I was just going to pick up on Lila's point before about, doing small things incrementally. In all honesty, I feel like we've still got a long way to go with organisations, including people with disability, and the entire, sort of product life cycle. But I've certainly seen, I've been in this space for 10 years, and I've definitely seen, though, more organisations engaging people with disability. And sometimes it's also getting a bit of momentum. So not many people can argue with, at least in Australia, that 1 in 5 people have a disability, according to the census data. So make that case for 1 in 5 people when we're doing user research, when we're doing usability testing, 1 in 5 people should have a disability. It's not necessarily going to be representative to start with. It's not going to give you a nice big group, but get that momentum. And, often then you get a person in and you show how a product may not work for them, and that's the aha moment for everyone, going, oh, that's why we need to be doing this. So build on that.
Look, the other thing that I would highly recommend is try making sure every time you advertise a position that you encourage people with disability to apply. Employ them. Internal change of just the ordinariness of having a person around all the time, a number of people around, really changes culture, because it changes that, a person with a disability changes to, Danielle, or, Fiona, or, Abdul, or whatever. So, it's not, becoming diverse and engaging diversely should bring about, an organisation that looks more like the community that you're living in and serving. And I can tell you the employment figures have been horrible for the last 30 years. And employment breaks poverty cycles as well. So that's off digital accessibility, but there's some bloody great technical people with disability out there that work as consultants and in other spaces as well, because they got sick of being badly treated in employment roles. So, you know, think about your procurement, think about your employment, et cetera, et cetera. And I just happen to be working on employment at the moment.
You can also use interns. So the Australian Network on Disability has an intern program that's amazing, and you know, it's something that we've utilised and we plan on utilising even further in the future to make sure that we're matching and really understanding which roles suit well for co-design in that space as well. But I agree with multiple channels for consultation. I was lucky the organisation I worked in had many different ways that we could engage our customers. So we would engage them in social groups and special forums. We would engage them via research by external agencies through user testing. You won't always have enough funding to be able to do all those bits and pieces. But if you can, do think about different ways of talking to people in the disability community and always pay them. We're really strict on that. Where I was working, we always paid our, you know, the people that worked with us in consultation.